Hello, family. Enjoy this relaxing moment with Surly Tales. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. Whispers in the Walls. The scorching afternoon sun blazed over the bustling streets of Surulere, Lagos, painting golden hues over rooftops and casting long shadows on the quiet residential lanes. The rhythmic sound of street vendors calling out their wares mixed with the distant honking of Kiki Napeps and the occasional blaring of Fuji music from nearby beer parlors. Miriam Adewale stepped out of a yellow-painted taxi, her arms weighed down by 2 heavy bags of groceries. Beads of sweat trickled down her dark skin as she sighed, adjusting the wrapper tied securely around her waist. "Madam, a beg balance," the taxi driver called out. Miriam smiled apologetically, fishing for some crumpled Naira notes in her handbag. "Sorry, Oga, no vex." As she handed him the money, her eyes drifted toward her house, a 3-bedroom duplex tucked neatly between 2 towering palm trees. It was a beautiful home, standing as a testament to her husband Tunde's hard work and ambition. They had moved in 2 years ago, after his furniture business Adewale Woods took off, and life had been comfortable, at least on the surface. Pushing open the gate, she stepped into the compound, nodding at their gateman, Baba Muri, who was seated under a makeshift canopy, chewing on a piece of roasted corn. "Welcome, madam," he greeted. "Thank you, Baba Muri. Hope no wahala?" "No wahala, madam. But Oga never come back since morning." Miriam's brow furrowed slightly. He said he would be back early today. Maybe traffic don hold am for 3rd Mainland Bridge, Baba Muri suggested with a shrug. Miriam chuckled dryly. Maybe. She entered the house, the cool air inside offering instant relief from the oppressive heat. Setting the groceries on the marble countertop in the kitchen, she exhaled deeply. Despite the comfort of their home, something had felt off lately. For the past few weeks, her husband, Tunde, had been acting strangely distant, withdrawn. He barely spoke at dinner, often giving vague responses when she asked about his day. Worse still, he had taken a newfound obsession with the basement. The basement had always been his private space. When they moved in, he had converted it into a workshop where he crafted custom furniture. Miriam had respected his space, never questioning his need for privacy. But lately, his visits had become more frequent, sometimes disappearing down there for hours, even late into the night. And then there were the noises. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, the result of a tired mind playing tricks on her. But the more she paid attention, the more she noticed them, faint whispers drifting through the walls, low murmurs that didn't sound like they belonged to Tunde, or to anyone at all. She had tried asking him about it once. "Tunde, do you hear strange noises in the house?" His fork had frozen midair before he carefully placed it back on his plate. "No, I don't." "Are you sure?" "Sometimes, when you're in the basement." "Miriam, I said I don't hear anything," he had snapped, his voice unusually sharp. That was when she knew something was wrong. And now, standing in the middle of her kitchen, a chilling thought crossed her mind. What if Tunde wasn't just hiding from her? What if he was hiding something? The locked door. Later that evening, as the sky turned a deep shade of orange, Miriam sat on the living room couch, flipping mindlessly through channels on the TV. Tunde was still not home, and her unease grew stronger with every passing hour. Eventually, she picked up her phone and dialed his number. The call rang once, twice. "The number you have dialed is not reachable at the moment. Please try again later." She sighed, dropping the phone beside her. Something was definitely not right. Then she heard it. A soft thud. It came from the basement. Miriam's heart pounded as she turned her head towards the hallway. The door to the basement stood at the far end, its steel handle gleaming under the fluorescent light. She stood up hesitantly, her bare feet padding softly against the cold tiled floor. The house was silent, save for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the sound of her own heartbeat. Another thud. This time, louder. She swallowed hard, moving closer. "Don't do this, Miriam," her mind warned. But curiosity had already taken over. Reaching the door, she hesitated before grasping the handle. She turned it slightly, of course it was. But as she leaned in, straining to listen, she heard something else, something that sent shivers running down her spine. A whisper. Incoherent. Almost pleading. Then a scraping sound, like nails against concrete. Miriam stumbled back, her breath coming in short gasps. Someone, or something, was inside that basement. At that moment, she heard the sound of the gate creaking open outside. Tunde was home. Her pulse still racing, she rushed to the living room just as her husband entered. His white shirt was stained with something dark, something that looked like blood. Her eyes darted to his face, but he was calm, too calm. "You're back late," she managed to say, forcing her voice to remain steady. Tunde nodded, setting his bag down on the floor. Traffic. She wanted to ask about the blood. She wanted to scream at him about the whispers, the sounds, the locked basement door. But she didn't. Instead, she simply stared at him, and for the first time in their marriage, she realized something terrifying. She didn't really know the man she had married. And whatever secret he was hiding, it was buried deep in the basement, where no one was ever meant to find it. The locked door. The night settled over Suralire, wrapping the neighborhood in a blanket of humid silence. The once bustling streets had quieted, save for the occasional bark of stray dogs and the distant echo of a generator humming in the next compound. Inside the Adewale home, Miriam sat in bed, her body tense with unease. Tunde had taken a quick shower and gone straight to bed, barely exchanging more than a few words with her. His silence wasn't new, but tonight, it felt heavier. Her mind raced with thoughts of the basement door and the sounds she had heard earlier. She wanted to ask him, what was down there? Why did he come home with blood on his shirt? But she knew her husband. Tunde was not a man who appreciated confrontation, and when pushed, he pushed back harder. So she stayed silent. But she wasn't going to let it go. The desperate search. The next morning, Miriam woke to the sound of Tunde leaving early for work. She waited until she heard the car pull out of the driveway before she got out of bed, her heartbeat hammering against her ribs. Today was the day. She had to find out what was in the basement. Still in her nightgown, she walked towards the basement door at the end of the hallway. She placed her hand on the handle and turned it. Locked, as expected. Biting her lip, she turned back and went to the wardrobe in their bedroom. Tunde kept his spare keys somewhere. He had to. She dug through drawers, shifting documents and loose change. Nothing. Then she spotted his old leather jacket hanging in the back of the closet. A strange instinct made her reach inside its pocket. Her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. She pulled out a key. Her breath caught in her throat as she turned it over in her palm. This was it. Heart pounding, she stepped back into the hallway and approached the basement door once more. She slid the key into the lock, hesitating. Then, with a deep breath, she turned it. The lock clicked. The door creaked open. And the smell hit her instantly. A thick, metallic stench filled the air, making her gag. It was a scent she had smelled before. Blood. She stepped inside, her bare feet touching the cool concrete floor. The single bulb flickered dimly, casting eerie shadows across the room. And then she saw it. The cage. At the far end of the basement, against the wall, stood a large, rusted metal cage. Miriam's breath hitched in her throat. The cage was not empty. Inside it, slumped against the bars, was a man. His clothes were torn and bloodied, his skin pale and covered in bruises. His head was tilted forward, motionless. Was he dead? She took a trembling step forward. Hello. The man jerked violently, his head snapping up. Miriam gasped and stumbled backward, pressing her hand against her mouth to stifle a scream. His eyes. They were wild, sunken, and filled with a terrifying mix of rage and desperation. His cracked lips moved as he tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. Help me. Miriam's stomach twisted in horror. She turned, rushing for the door, her entire body shaking. But before she could reach it, a voice stopped her in her tracks. A deep, familiar voice. Miriam. She froze. Slowly, she turned around. Tunde stood at the top of the basement stairs. Watching her. His face was unreadable, but his dark eyes were filled with something she had never seen before. Something dangerous. "What are you doing down here?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. Miriam's mouth opened, but no words came out. Tunde stepped forward, his expression cold. "I told you never to come down here." The confrontation. Miriam felt her pulse thundering in her ears. Her hands were clammy as she pressed herself against the basement wall, her eyes darting between her husband and the man in the cage. "Tunde, who is he?" she whispered. Tunde didn't answer immediately. He simply exhaled, his fingers tightening into fists at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured. "He's no one you need to worry about." Miriam shook her head. "Oh. No, you're lying." She pointed at the cage, her voice rising. "You have a man locked up in our house, Tunde. He's hurt. What the hell is going on?" Tunde's jaw tensed. He took another step closer, his movements slow, deliberate. "You shouldn't have come down here, Miriam." She felt trapped. Her husband, the man she had loved for years, was hiding something monstrous. Something terrifying. "Tunde, just tell me the truth," she pleaded. "I won't." "I told you to stay out of it," he snapped suddenly, his voice sharp as a blade. Miriam flinched. The man in the cage let out a strangled sound, half a whimper, half a growl. Tunde turned to him, his expression dark. "Shut up." Miriam's breath came fast and shallow. "Tunde, have you been hurting him?" A long silence. Then, to her shock, Tunde laughed. It was a low, humorless chuckle, the kind that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "You think this is about hurting someone?" he murmured. He turned back to her, and for the first time, Miriam saw something in his face that made her blood turn cold. Not guilt, not regret, but fear. Tunde was afraid of the man in the cage. "Miriam," he said quietly, stepping closer, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." She stiffened. "Whatever you think is happening here, it's much worse." Her mouth went dry. "Worse?" Tunde nodded. He glanced toward the cage, then back at her. "This man," his voice dropped lower. "He's not what he seems." Miriam's gaze flickered to the man in the cage. His chest rose and fell unevenly, his hands twitching at his sides. She could feel it now, something was wrong. Something deeply unnatural. "I was trying to keep you safe," Tunde murmured. Miriam's throat tightened. Her husband had always been a good man. A kind man. But right now, standing in this cold basement, with a bloodied prisoner locked in a cage and whispers still echoing through the walls, she wasn't sure she knew him at all. And worst of all, she wasn't sure if she wanted to. Strange noises. The silence between them. The next morning, the Adewale home was filled with an uncomfortable silence. Miriam sat at the dining table, stirring a cup of tea she had no intention of drinking. The spoon clinked against the ceramic in a slow, repetitive motion. Across from her, Tunde ate quietly, his eyes fixed on his plate. He had said nothing about the events of the night before. No explanations. No justifications. Nothing. It was as if their confrontation in the basement had never happened. Miriam's mind, however, was in turmoil. She couldn't erase the image of the man in the cage, his sunken eyes pleading with her, his voice cracked with desperation. And yet, what haunted her even more was the look in Tunde's eyes, the raw, unmistakable fear. If Tunde was afraid of him, then what exactly was he? Miriam cleared her throat. "Tunde," she started, carefully choosing her words. Her husband didn't look up. She hesitated before continuing. "You said last night that the man wasn't what he seemed." Tunde's fork paused midair. His whole body tensed. Miriam swallowed hard. "I want to know what you meant." Slowly, Tunde set his fork down and finally met her gaze. His eyes were dark, unreadable. "I told you to let it go." "I can't." A muscle in his jaw tightened. "You have to." Miriam exhaled sharply, frustrated. "Tunde, you're keeping a human being locked in a cage. How do you expect me to let that go?" Tunde stood abruptly, grabbing his briefcase from the side of the table. "We're not having this conversation, Miriam." He turned to leave, but she grabbed his wrist. "I'm your wife. You owe me the truth." For a moment, Tunde hesitated, his fingers tightening around the handle of his briefcase. Then, without another word, he pulled away and walked out the door. Miriam sat back down, gripping the edge of the table as she watched the front gate swing shut behind him. She was done waiting for answers. If he wouldn't tell her the truth, she would find it herself. The whispers return. That night, Tunde didn't come home. Miriam paced the living room, glancing at the clock on the wall. 11:42 p.m. Her phone calls had gone straight to voicemail. She knew exactly where he was. The basement. A creeping unease settled over her skin. She thought about the way Tunde's expression had darkened when she questioned him. The way he had looked at the man in the cage not with anger, but with dread. And then there was the other thing. The noises. The whispers in the walls had started again. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, soft murmurs floating through the house like a ghost's breath. But the longer she listened, the clearer they became. They weren't just whispers. They were voices. And they were calling her name. Miriam. She whipped around, eyes scanning the room. The air was thick with something unseen, something she could feel pressing against her skin. Thud. The sound came from beneath her feet. The basement. Another thud, followed by a low guttural sound that made her stomach churn. Something was happening down there. And for the first time, she felt a terrible, sinking realization. Maybe the man in the cage wasn't the only thing trapped in that basement. Into the darkness. Miriam stood at the basement door, her fingers trembling around the handle. Don't do this, her mind warned. But it was too late. She turned the key. The door creaked open. And the smell hit her like a wave, thick, metallic, rotten. Holding her breath, she stepped inside. The light bulb flickered, casting eerie shadows across the concrete walls. The cage at the far end loomed in the dimness, but something was different. The man inside was awake. And he was staring directly at her. Miriam froze. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his eyes feverish and glassy. You shouldn't be here, he rasped. Miriam licked her dry lips. Who are you? His breathing shuddered. Your husband doesn't want you to know. A sharp chill ran down her spine. Know what? His hands, wrapped in filthy bandages, clenched around the rusted bars. That I'm not the one you should be afraid of? Miriam's skin prickled. What do you mean? The man in the cage let out a weak, bitter laugh. You think I'm the monster here? He shook his head. I was brought here. Just like you. Miriam's blood ran cold. What? Before he could respond, a loud click echoed through the basement. The door behind her shut. Miriam whirled around. And there stood Tunde, his face shadowed in the dim light. His hands were tucked into his pockets, but there was something about the way he stood, still, patient, waiting, that made her breath hitch. I told you to stay out of this, Miriam. She took a step back. Tunde. But before she could finish, the whispers in the walls grew louder. And this time, they weren't just calling her name. They were laughing. Tunde let out a slow sigh, running a hand down his face. You've made things worse, he muttered. The air shifted. The lights flickered violently, casting grotesque shadows along the walls. And then, the man in the cage started screaming. The revelation. Miriam's heart pounded violently as the man's screams turned into something else, something primal, something unnatural. His body convulsed, twisting in ways that no human body should. His fingernails elongated, black veins crawling across his pale skin. And his eyes turned black. Miriam staggered back, her breath coming in frantic gasps. What is this? She shrieked. Tunde didn't answer. He simply stood there watching. The man in the cage let out a deep, guttural growl, something no human throat should be able to produce. Then he lunged. The bars rattled violently, bending as if they were made of nothing more than soft wire. Miriam let out a strangled cry, scrambling backward. Tunde finally spoke, his voice eerily calm. This is why I locked him up. Miriam whipped around to face her husband, her eyes wide with horror and betrayal. You knew. Her voice was barely a whisper. Tunde's gaze remained cold. Of course I knew. The whispers swelled, filling the room with an almost unbearable pressure. Miriam's hands shook violently. The man in the cage had told her something that now burned into her mind like a curse. I was brought here, just like you. She stared at Tunde, dread sinking into her bones. Because now she understood. She wasn't the one uncovering a secret. She was part of it. And whatever was trapped in this basement, it was only the beginning. The dark truth. The thing in the cage. The basement shook with inhuman howls, the sound rattling inside Miriam's skull like an unbearable screech of madness. The thing, in the cage thrashed violently, its elongated claws scraping against the rusted metal bars. Black veins pulsed beneath its skin, its jaw unhinging wider than should have been humanly possible. Miriam's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she pressed herself against the cold basement wall, her body trembling. This wasn't a man. This was something else. The realization settled deep inside her chest like ice. Behind her, Tunde stood motionless, his expression eerily calm as if he had already made peace with what he was witnessing. Miriam turned to him, her voice shaking. "Tunde, what the hell is going on?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sighed, rubbing his temple as if this conversation exhausted him. Then he muttered, "You should have never come down here." The monster let out another guttural snarl, slamming its body against the bars. The cage groaned under the pressure, the rusted hinges bending slightly. Miriam flinched. "Tunde, talk to me. What is that thing?" Tunde finally looked at her. And what Miriam saw in his eyes made her stomach churn. It wasn't fear. It was resignation. Like a man who had been waiting for this moment. "It's not a thing, Miriam." His voice was eerily low. "It's a man." Miriam felt her blood turn cold. "That's not a man, Tunde." Tunde inhaled deeply before answering. "He was." Her body stiffened. She could still hear the whispers in the walls, twisting around her, filling the room with something unseen but undeniably present. And then, Tunde finally said the words that made her knees go weak. "He's my brother." A terrible past. Miriam felt as if the ground had been yanked from beneath her feet. Brother? Tunde had never mentioned having a brother. In all their years of marriage he had spoken about his late parents, his childhood struggles, and his business triumphs. But never a brother. Her lips parted, but she couldn't find the words. Tunde continued before she could speak. "His name is Adeola." He glanced at the thrashing creature in the cage, his face tired and full of something too complex to name. Or at least it was. Miriam shook her head in disbelief. "Tunde, you're not making any sense. That thing in there is not a man." Tunde's jaw tightened. "I know how it looks, but I swear to you, Miriam, he was human. He was my older brother." Miriam looked at the monster again, her stomach twisting painfully. She felt like she was trapped in a waking nightmare. None of this made sense. She took a deep, shuddering breath. What happened to him? Tunde's face darkened. He hesitated for a long time before finally answering. "A curse." Miriam felt her heart stutter in her chest. A curse? She didn't believe in superstitions. Not really. But standing here, in this basement where the air itself felt unnatural, where the shadows seemed to move, where a man had transformed into something monstrous before her very eyes. She wasn't so sure anymore. Tunde ran a tired hand down his face. "It started when we were younger. Back in our village." Miriam swallowed hard. "Which village?" Tunde hesitated, then answered. "Ijebuode." Miriam stiffened. She had heard stories about Ijebuode, old tales whispered by elders about dark rituals and ancient spirits. She had always dismissed them as folklore. Until now. Tunde continued. Adeola was different. He was always drawn to things he shouldn't be. Dark things. When we were kids, he spent more time with the old Dibias than with our own family. He was obsessed with old magic, with rituals our elders had banned long ago. Miriam felt a cold shiver creep up her spine. Tunde's voice dropped lower. One night he performed something forbidden. Miriam felt a lump form in her throat. What did he do? Tunde swallowed. He made a deal. The price of power. Miriam didn't realize she had been holding her breath. A deal. She felt sick. Tunde kept his gaze fixed on the cage. He was trying to unlock something. A power, He thought it would make him stronger, untouchable. Miriam shuddered. And? Tunde's face twisted with something that looked like guilt. It worked. Miriam's stomach clenched. He exhaled slowly. But power like that comes with a price. He wasn't the same after that night. His body changed. His mind changed. It was slow at first, whispers in his head, shadows that followed him where there were none. But then he became... He gestured toward the thing in the cage, its inhuman eyes now fixed directly on her. Miriam felt something cold coil around her spine. "So you locked him up?" she asked quietly. Tunde's face hardened. "I had no choice." The whispers grew louder, curling around her ears like unseen fingers. The thing inside the cage spoke again, its voice low, guttural, yet disturbingly human. "Your husband is a liar." Miriam's breath hitched. Tunde stepped forward immediately, his voice sharp. "Don't listen to him." The creature chuckled, a sick, twisted sound. "He didn't put me in here to protect you. He put me in here because he's afraid I'll tell you the truth." Miriam's blood turned to ice. She turned back to Tunde. "What is he talking about?" Tunde clenched his jaw. "Miriam, don't." Bang. The lights flickered violently, and the basement shook. The whispers in the walls exploded into chaotic voices, hissing, laughing, screaming all at once. The cage door burst open. Miriam screamed. Tunde lunged for her, but the creature moved faster. In a flash of darkness, it was gone. The basement door slammed shut, trapping them inside. And as the voices cackled madly, whispering dark secrets into the air, Miriam realized, with bone-deep horror, whatever they had just unleashed was far worse than anything they could imagine. The escape. The creature breaks free. The air grew thick, pressing against Miriam's skin like an unseen force as the basement door slammed shut. The whispers in the walls swelled, laughing, chanting, taunting. She couldn't breathe. She whipped around, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cage was empty. The thing that had once been Tunde's brother was gone. And Tunde? He stood completely still, his face paler than she had ever seen it. His eyes were wide, staring into the shadows where the creature had disappeared. Miriam's voice was barely above a whisper. "Where is he?" Tunde didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because at that moment, a low guttural growl rumbled from the darkness. The lights went out. Trapped in the dark. Miriam's breath hitched. Total darkness swallowed the basement. She reached out blindly, grabbing for Tunde's arm. "Tunde," she hissed. His fingers wrapped around hers, tight, firm. "Stay close." The growl came again, closer this time. Something moved in the dark, shifting with an unnatural speed. Miriam's skin prickled, her senses screaming at her to rush. But where? The door was locked. They were trapped down here. A sudden rush of air. Something luagid. Miriam barely had time to react before she was torn away from Tunde's grip. An invisible force slammed into her, sending her crashing into the wall. Pain exploded through her shoulder. She gasped, struggling to see, to move, to fight. But cold hand gripped her throat, lifting her off the ground. And then, the creature spoke. Adeola's truth. "You don't know what he is, do you?" Miriam's lunga burned, her hands clawing at the inhuman grip tightening around her neck. The voice that spoke was not human, but somewhere beneath the monstrous growl. She could still hear it. "Adeola," she choked out. The grip tightened. "He's lied to you," the voice hissed. "Has lied to you about everything." Miriam's vision blurred. "Please?" Then, just as suddenly as he had grabbed her, "I'll let go." Miriam collapsed onto the cold floor, gasping for air. From the darkness, Adeola loomed over her, his glowing eyes piercing through the shadows. Tunde rushed forward, grabbing her and pulling her behind him. "Adeola," Tunde said, his voice low. "Cautious." The thing in the dark laughed. "You still pretend, little brother?" Adeola's voice was mocking. "You still Lin?" Miriam clutched at Tunde's arm. "Tuada. What is he talking about?" Tunde didn't answer. Adeola moved, stepping into the dim light cast by the flickering bulb. His body was partially human, but his skin pulsed with something dark, something alive. "I was cursed," Adeola said, tilting his head. "But so was he." Miriam frowned, harpules pounding in her ears. What? Adeola's lips curled. Did he tell you what we did? What he did? Miriam turned to Tunde, demanding answers. Tunde. But Tunde's expression was cold. Like a man who had already made up his mind. Miriam's stomach twisted. Something was wrong. And then, Tuada pulled a knife from his pocket. The betrayal. Everything happened in a blur. 1 second, Tunde was standing in front of her, shielding her. The next, he lunged at Adeola. Miriam screamed. Adeola dodged the blade, moving with a speed that was inhuman. He grabbed Tunde's wrist, twisting it violently. Tunde groaned in pala, his knife clattering to the floor. Miriam stood frozen, her mind racing. Tunde had tried to kill his own brother. Tunde, she cried. What are you doing? Tunde gritted his teeth, his eyes flashing. We don't have time for this. Miriam. Adeola laughed darkly. He didn't tell you. Did he? Tell me what? Miriam shouted. Adeola smirked. Then he turned to Tunde. Tell her what you really are. Miriam stared at her husband, her chest tightening. What is he talking about? She demanded. Tunde's hands shook. I was trying to protect you, he said quietly. Miriam, a heartbeat stopped. Because suddenly, the truth clicked into place. The whispers in the walls. The fear in Tunde's eyes. The secrets. And worst of all, the fact that Tunde wasn't afraid of Adeola. Adeola was afraid of him. Miriam's breath hitched. Her husband's face was unreadable. Then he said it. The words that made her world collapse. Adeola wasn't the only one cursed. The other monster. Miriam felt the air leave her lungs. She stepped backward, away from both. Adeola watched her carefully. Tunde's eyes darkened. I tried to keep it from you, he admitted. T tried to hide it. To control it. Adeola's voice was bitter. But you couldn't, could you? Miriam's pulse raced. No. Tunde admitted. His body started to change. Miriam's hands clapped pad over her mouth as Tunde's veins darkened, pulsing with the same sick black energy she had seen in Adeola. His fingers twisted, his bones cracked, his eyes shifted, turning darker, emptier. Miriam stumbled back. Tunde? Her husband looked at her, and for the first time, he wasn't human. Adeola smirked. Now you see. Miriam shook her head, trembling. No, she whispered. No. The whispers in the walls screamed. And as Tunde's transformation completed, his monstrous form towering in front of her, Miriam realized Aha had married something far worse than a liar. She had married a monster. And now, it was too late to escape. The curse. The transformation. Miriam's body trembled as she pressed herself against the cold basement wall, her breath coming in sharp gasps. Before her, Tunde was no longer human. His skin had darkened, veins pulsing with unnatural energy. His fingers had lengthened, twisting into sharp, claw-like appendages. His face was distorted, no longer bearing the warmth of the moss she had married. His eyes were hollow voids, black and endless, filled with a hunger she could not understand. Adeola stood beside her, watching his brother with a mix of amusement and loathing. You see now, don't you? Adeola said, his voice dripping with mockery. You thought he was protecting you. Miriam shook her head, her stomach twisting. Tunde's head snapped toward her, and in that instant, she wasn't sure if he recognized her at all. Then he moved. Too fast. Before she could react, he lunged at her. Miriam screamed, throwing herself to the ground as Tunde's claws swiped through the air where she had stood seconda before. The concrete wall behind her cracked, dust and debris falling from the impact. Adeola cursed under his breath. I told you. Miriam scrambled away, her heart hammering. Tunde, please. Stop. For a brief second, something flickered in Tunde's expression. Recognition. Hesitation. But then, his head tilted unnaturally, his spine arched, and the darkness inside him won. His voice, now lagered with something inhuman, whispered. Ruh. Miriam felt cold terror grip her chest. Miriam didn't wait. She turned and ran, her feet barely making contact with the cold floor as she bolted for the basement door. Behind her, She heard the sickening scrape of claws against concrete. She didn't dare look back. Her trembling hands reached for the door handle, yanking hard, but her stomach plummeted. A shadow loomed over her, and in the next second, she felt something cold wrap around her ankle. Tunde's clawed hand. She barely had time to react before he yanked her off her feet, sending her crashing onto the hard ground. Pain shot through her reba, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to. She kicked wildly, her foot connecting with something solid. Tunde let out a deep, guttural growl and released her. She scrambled away just as Adeola lunged forward, ramming into his brother with inhuman speed. The two criaturas collided, a thunderous impact shaking the basement walls. For a moment, Miriam could only stare in horror as the two brothers fought two beings, once human, now monstrous. They were a blur of black veins, claws, and unholy strength. Adeola, despite his earlier frailty, was holding his own. "Tunde!" Miriam shouted. "You can fight this'll." Tunde's dark eyes flickered toward her. And for a brief moment, he hesitated again. That hesitation cost him. Adeola moved faster, his claws slicing across Tunde's chest in a single, brutal motion. Tunde let out a pained roar, staggering back as black liquid oozed from his wound. Miriam's stomach twisted violently at the sight. Adeola turned to her, his expression horrendous. "You have a choice," he said. Miriam frowned, panting. "What?" Adeola gestured toward Tunde's shaking form, his breath ragged. "He's not going to stop," he said coldly. "Not until he kills you." Miriam's chest tightened. "No, he wouldn't." Adeola's glowing eyes bored into hers. "You still think there's something human left in him?" His voice was sharp, bitter. Miriam glanced at Tunde, who was hunched over, his monstrous form twitching, his body trying to shift back into something human. His breathing was ragged, pained, but his eyes locked onto hers. And in that instant she saw him. Her husband. Terrified. "Tunde," she whispered. His lips parted lightly, as if he wanted to respond. But then his body convulsed violently, and the darkness surged through him once more. Miriam felt tears sting her eyes. Adeola sighed, picking up Tunde's fallen kaifa. "There's only one way this ends." Miriam shook her head violently. "No." Adeola didn't respond. He simply raised the knife. Miriam's breath caught in her throat. And then, Tunde attacked. The final blow. It happened so fast. Tunde moved like a shadow, his claws slicing through the air. Adeola dodged, rolling across the floor. The knife gleaming in his grip. Miriam's pulse pounded as she watched the two brothers fight for the last time. A brutal clash of monsters. And then, Adeola drove the knife straight at Tunde's heart. Miriam screamed. Tunde staggered, his monstrous form twitching violently. For a moment he just stood there, his body trembling. He fell to his knees. Miriam rushed forward as Tunde's form slowly shifted back, the black veins receding, his claws withdrawing, his face becoming human again. She fell beside him, cradling him in her arms. "Tunde," she sobbed. He looked at her. His eyes now brows again, filled with pain and regret. "I tried." His voice was barely a whisper. "I tried to protect you." Miriam choked on a sob, shaking her head. "You did." Tunde's fingers brushed against hers weakly. His body once still. Miriam, a heart shattered. She let out a strangled sob, pressing her forehead against his. He was gone. The whispers in the walls fell silent. The basement, once filled with chaos, was now just a tomb. The aftermath. Miriam didn't know how long she sat there, holding her husband's lifeless body. The pain was unbearable. Eventually, she felt a presence beside her. Adeola. She slowly lifted her head, her eyes filled with raw emotion. He didn't speak. Neither did she. There was nothing left to say. Without a word, Adeola turned and left the basement, disappearing into the night. Miriam didn't stop him. She simply stayed there, surrounded by the weight of what she had lost. The whispers had disappeared. The monsters were gone. But in their place, a different darkness had settled inside her. One that would never leave. The reckoning. The funeral of shadows. The sun hung low and tired over the Lagos skyline, casting a dim, orange glow across the cemetery. The air was thick with silence, a silence heavier than morning. It was the silence of unfinished stories, of secrets buried in shallow graves. Miriam stood at the edge of the burial site, her black gown billowing in the soft evening breeze. The pastor's voice was a distant hum in her ears, drowned out by the relentless ache in her chest. She had cried all the tears she had. Now there was nothing left. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, dirt cascading onto the polished wood, she gripped the edge of her shawl, her knuckles white. Tunde Adewale was gone. Her husband, her love, the monster she never knew lived beside her. A hand gently touched her shoulder. She turned slightly to see Auntie Remy, Tunde's only living relative. Her face was lined with age and sorrow, her eyes filled with the weight of things she would never say. "He was a good man," Auntie Remy whispered. Miriam's heart clenched. Was he? Or had she simply loved the idea of him too much to see the truth? She nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to speak. As the last rites were spoken and the mourners slowly dispersed, Miriam remained, standing over the grave of the man who had been her world, and the darkness she had barely survived. A visitor in the night. The house felt different now. The whispers were gone, but in their absence was an emptiness she didn't know how to fill. She wandered through the hallways, her fingers trailing over furniture she and Tunde had once picked out together. It felt like a stranger's home now. A house haunted not by ghosts, but by truths she could no longer ignore. Night fell, and still, she did not sleep. She sat at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea growing cold beside her. A knock at the door. Her heart stopped. Slowly she rose, her bare feet making no sound as she moved toward the entrance. She hesitated, hand hovering over the handle. Another knock. She exhaled sharply, then pulled it open. Standing there, bathed in the pale glow of the streetlights, was Adeola. Miriam's breath hitched. His face was shadowed, unreadable. But his eyes, those glowing, cursed eyes, held something she couldn't name. Regret? Guilt? Or something far worse? "I told you he wasn't what he seemed," Adeola said softly. Miriam's fingers tightened around the doorframe. "You killed him," she whispered, voice raw. Adeola shook his head. "No," he paused, eyes dark. "You did." Miriam staggered back, the words hitting her like a physical blow. "No," she choked. "That's not." "He didn't die because of me," Adeola interrupted, stepping closer. "He died because of you." Miriam's head spun. "That's a lie." Adeola exhaled. "Is it?" Miriam's chest tightened. "What do you want?" Adeola studied her carefully. Then he said something that made her blood run cold. "You can feel it, can't you?" Miriam's body stiffened. The air between them grew heavy, as if the very walls of the house were leaning in to listen. "You think the curse ended with Tunde?" Adeola continued, his voice low. "It didn't?" Miriam swallowed hard. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to call him a liar, to slam the door in his face, to pretend she was free. But she couldn't, because she had felt it. The strange tightness in her chest. The way the air shifted around her when she was alone. The whispers that had stopped, only to be replaced with something else. A pulse of darkness beneath her skin. A shadow that moved when she did not. Something inside her had changed. And she knew, with a horrible certainty, it had started the moment Tunde died in her arms. The new curse. Miriam felt cold all over. Adeola's eyes held her in place. "You have it now," he murmured. Miriam's stomach twisted painfully. "No. Yes." She shook her head violently. "That's not possible." Adeola took a step closer, his voice like a dark whisper. "Didn't you ever wonder why he kept you away from all of this? Why he hid the truth for so long?" Miriam clenched her fists. "Because he was protecting me." But was that really true? Or had he been protecting himself? Had he known that if she ever found out, if she ever became part of this, she wouldn't be able to leave? Miriam's pulse thundered. "What do I do?" Adeola's expression darkened. "You run." Miriam froze. "What?" Adeola's voice was firm now. "Leave. Get as far away from here as you can. Before it's too late." Miriam's skin prickled. "I don't understand," she whispered. Adeola stepped forward, his face inches from hers now. His voice dropped lower, filled with something deadly and knowing. "It's already inside you, Miriam," she gasped, stepping back, gripping her chest. Her breath hitched because suddenly, she felt it. Something moving beneath her skin. Something waking up. A slow, insidious presence curling around her heart. It wasn't just the memories of Tunde that were haunting her. It was him. Miriam let out a shuddering breath. No. Adeola's gaze held no mercy. "Run," he said again, stepping into the darkness. "Before you become the next monster." The final choice. Miriam locked the door, her fingers trembling. She backed away slowly, her mind racing. She had two choices. Or stay and fight whatever was inside her. She looked down at her hands. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw them flicker. Like a shadow was crawling over her skin. Her breath came fast and uneven. The whispers in the walls were gone. But something far worse had taken their place. And as she stood in her darkened home, alone with the truth, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't afraid of the curse anymore. Because deep down, she knew it was already too late. And for the first time, she wasn't sure if she even wanted to stop it. The end. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.